You know, it probably would have been more true to the spirit of the original show, and more fun for me if I'd just taken the Tide Pod Challenge instead of playing these games. Hi, I'm Joe, and this is Same Name, Different Game. Like I promised last month, once again this month we are going back to look at some portable versions of games that I have already looked at. Because I hate myself, we're going back to the stagnant, fetid well that is Beavis and Butt-Head. Longtime viewers of this show will remember that back in 2012, I looked at the Super Nintendo and Genesis games, and at the time I said, games also came out on the Game Gear the same year, and the Game Boy 4 years later. I'm just glad I didn't touch those at all. Ah, me from 6 years ago, you sweet summer child. You don't know how right you were. So, let's go ahead and get the only fun part of this out of the way with a little history. Here's a fun fact. The first time I used the phrase, a little history, was in the original Beavis and Butt-Head episode. Anyways, Beavis and Butt-Head was created by Mike Judge in 1992 for a short called Frog Baseball. It was put in Spike and Mike's Festival of Animation, where it was apparently seen by someone at MTV and selected for inclusion on Liquid Television, a show comprised of bizarre animated shorts. Very quickly, MTV picked up the show for a brief pilot season of its own, aired in 1993. This was immediately successful in part due to its controversy and led to an original run of 7 seasons, a theatrical film released in 1996, a spin-off in 1997, a myriad of merchandising tie-ins including books, t-shirts, and of course video games, and a return for an 8th season in 2011. For a show that was only on for 7 seasons over a scant 4-year period, there are a lot of Beavis and Butt-Head games. According to Moby Games, there were 12, including the unreleased arcade cabinet, all of them exclusive to North America. The first game we'll be covering this episode was released in 1994 alongside the Genesis and SNES titles. It was developed by NewFX, who would be acquired by EA in 2004, and published by Viacom New Media. It's Beavis and Butt-Head on the Sega Game Gear. Viacom New Media was formed in 1994 as part of the entertainment giant's interactive media division. Rather than license their properties to other publishers, Viacom decided to leverage them internally. Viacom New Media operated out of an office in suburban Chicago from their inception until they were rolled into the Viacom-owned Virgin Interactive in 1997. Most of their releases were based on MTV and Nickelodeon shows, Beavis and Butt-Head, obviously, but also Rocko's Modern Life, Guts, Ah Real Monsters, and even a CD-ROM adventure game based on Are You Afraid of the Dark? Oddly, they also published a couple of games, Club Dead and Slamscape, that had MTV branding but were not based on actual programming. Viacom New Media took a page directly out of the LJN playbook. A media conglomerate created a publisher to leverage their IP in the burgeoning world of video games, but they knew relatively little of the world of video games, and as a result released mostly junk. And that's true in both cases. Sadly, Beavis and Butt-Head for the Game Gear is not an exception, and in fact, may just be the nadir of Viacom New Media's output. This game marries the worst aspects of the Genesis and Super Nintendo games. The sprites are huge like the Genesis game, making avoiding obstacles nearly impossible. The gameplay is bland like the Super NES, consisting exclusively of walking to the right. I derided the SNES version for being a 2D walker several years ago, but this game takes it to a new level. I didn't think much of the set pieces in the 16-bit game, but at least they tried. Literally every single stage in this mess is just a straight shot to the right. And you would think this would make it easy and boring, and in a few stages that is true, but certainly not in the first one. Setting the tone for the rest of this disaster, the first stage is rife with unavoidable enemies and beginner's traps, requiring you to memorize the stage layout to complete it. I mean, just look here. The game has barely begun, and there's a bird and a rat that move at the same speed coming at you. So you either take the hit from the rat or jump into the bird, because, oh yeah, you don't get any weapons in this game. And then there's this fire hydrant. There's no way to know it's going to squirt water that will cause you to slide into this bomb until it happens.
Whoa, is that fucked? Yeah.
I guess we should talk about these screens, because it seems like most of the resources that went into this game went into these screens. When you take a hit or pick up an item, most of the time the game stops, cuts to a close-up of our titular morons, and they quip as they did on the show. Now, look, I get that this was pretty impressive for the Game Gear, but it's just too much. And with all these interjections, you'd think they'd put in some story sequences, but no. When you finish a stage, you move right to the next one without so much as a title card. Fortunately, you can turn these down in the options menu, but it's still too much. Also in the options menu, you can up the difficulty, and, well, all that does is change one thing. Whichever character you're not controlling can now take damage too. And, well, yeah, that does make the game harder, but not in anything even resembling a fair or interesting way. As I said, you're already beset by hazards and enemies on all sides with no weapons to defend yourself, so this makes the game effectively impossible. Finally, the options let you turn off the music, which you might want to do because it's truly ear-splitting. I know the Game Gear isn't exactly a musical powerhouse, but this is awful. It's the worst music I've heard on the system. In fact, this is the worst game I've played on the system. In something of an upset, it has unseated WWF Raw as the biggest train wreck on the Game Gear. However, I do like to look for that silver lining, so I have a couple of nice things to say. First, the voice work is really impressive for this platform. Second, as with the home console versions, Guar makes an appearance, and it's cool that they got a paycheck for that. Rest in peace, Dave Brockie. Finally, there's a nice nod to the show if you overeat. Yeah, you can overeat. So if your health bar gets too full, the game cuts to Beavis and Butt-Head in the bathroom moaning in pain. It's kind of annoying, but it's also honestly kind of clever and in line with the show's humor.
Shut up.
Still, with all of that said, it is 100% to be avoided. In the words of our protagonists, this sucks, change it. So, will our next game, Beavis and Butt-Head on the Nintendo Game Boy, developed by Taurus Games and published by GT Interactive, fare any better? Let's find out. Taurus Games is an Australian developer that is, somewhat surprisingly, still not only active in games, but as an unacquired, independent company. They broke into games with Stargate on the Game Boy in 1994 and have mostly worked on ports and licensed kids games for major publishers, as well as self-publishing some mobile games. In 2015, they worked with Monash University to create games and apps that help kids with developmental disabilities. So, good on you, Taurus. GT Interactive is, well, you might remember, they were the original publisher of a little indie game you might have heard of called Doom. Formed as the game division of a video distributor, and a budget one at that, Good Times Video, they had a pretty successful run in the 90s before eventually being acquired by Infogrames in 2000. Any IP they retained, which definitely does not include Doom, is now part of the modern-day Atari Inc. Okay, enough stalling. Let's talk about Beavis and Butt-Head on the Game Boy. Imagine, if you will, a Zelda game that's terrible. That's pretty much Beavis and Butt-Head in a nutshell. Released in 1999, 5 years after the Game Gear title, 2 years after the show ended, and 1 year after the Game Boy Color launched, this game smacks of the cheap license on the cheap-to-develop-for hardware that's experiencing an unexpected resurgence to make a quick buck type of release. I have no evidence that's actually the case, but, I mean, there's a pretty major Occam's razor thing going on here, right? Right. At any rate, the game consists of playing as the duo one at a time to wander around Highland from a mostly top-down perspective, getting key items and weapons on a somewhat interconnected map. It's bad Zelda. It's not unplayable. Unlike the Game Gear game, you actually do get weapons to defend yourself, and there is a story. A bad, loosely defined story, but a story that uses characters from the show nonetheless. It starts with Beavis getting detention and having to escape school to make it to his shift at Burger World on time. Once he escapes, he has to find his way off the campus, which is now a maze, I guess. Then he has to make his way through the sewers, and this is weird because only in this segment does the game become a side-scroller. A side-scroller with some of the worst controls I have ever witnessed. I mean, it's impossible to get Beavis to do anything. After you skip the sewers with a password, the duo meet at the park and you take control of Butt-Head. This involves a hedge maze with a lot of obnoxious birds and rodents, and could the people making this game really not come up with anything besides birds and rodents for enemies? Like, all of these Beavis and Butt-Head games have birds and rats. Come on. Anyway, you get to work, you have to deliver some food, then you run into Todd, and he makes you get some oil for his car, and he gets arrested for doing a burnout in a parking lot, which I feel is more like a getting a ticket kind of thing than a going to jail kind of thing, but whatever. And then in the final stage, you have to break Todd out of jail. Wait, hold up. Seriously? That's where we're going with this one? Look, it's one thing to have these two dimwits trying to get into a Gwar concert, that makes sense, but a jailbreak? And the jailbreak indicates one of the biggest problems here. In the worst moments, this game is just way too linear. I mean, in its best moments, it's still mediocre Zelda without most of what makes that series interesting and fun, but in parts like the jailbreak, it's literally a single path directly to a goal, not even an attempt at actual level design. No hidden areas or even obvious extra rooms, just a single path to Todd's cell, which then extends past it to a key, and then you walk back directly the way you came and open his cell. Fini. So, it's not the torture that the Game Gear version is, but it's still not good. Audiovisually, neither one of these are anything to write home about, but let's do like we always do, and take a look and a listen side by side.
Knocker. Shut up, Beavis.
While the Game Gear has some really nice character models, the stages themselves are all pretty bland. The Game Boy has some hideous character sprites that barely resemble Beavis and Butt-Head, but the cutscenes aren't terrible. The music on the Game Boy is repetitive and forgettable, but at least it isn't the shrill, ear-splitting noise of the Game Gear. And that makes it time to give The Edge. And much like with their console counterparts, I really cannot recommend either one of these games. The Game Boy version is at least playable, so I guess it backs into getting The Edge, but really, unless you are a huge Beavis and Butt-Head fan, avoid them both. If you must seek out a game in which you play as these two little wiener heads, I would suggest seeking out the point-and-click adventure game Virtual Stupidity. And that does it. Thank you so much for watching, as always, and come back next month because we are on the road to WrestleMania. And you know what that means.
CD-ROMs. Some are instructive, many are innovative, but they've never been idiotic. Until now.
Fryer! Fryer! Fryer!
Play Virtual Stupidity, the Beavis and Butt-Head CD-ROM misadventure game with the only two people who can't spell CD. There's bone-crunching action and pulse-pounding adventure on your quest to join Todd's gang.
Prison rules.
Just because you have a computer doesn't mean you can't be stupid. Available at retailers that don't suck.